Ross Douthat, welcome back to the Realignment for the third time. I think you are our guest, other than Matt Stoller, who we've had on the most.
That is really good company to be in, guys. Me and Matt Stoller together against neoliberalism. It's good to be back.
That's exactly what we need, Ross.
So, Ross, your book is coming out today in paperback, and it's to a certain degree the anniversary of the Decadent Society coming out last year, but it's also the anniversary of the last time we ever recorded in person, which was actually with you. So this episode has a deeper meaning beyond just an attempt to hawk books and get you on our calendar. So
it is profound, and I did not give you COVID-19. Is that correct? Because I think there's at least a 40% possibility that I had it and was contagious when we were hanging out.
As far as we know, neither of us have contracted COVID-19. I have not gotten the antibodies test, though. And actually, at this point, I don't even know if they'd still be there. So
they probably wouldn't be, yeah. So if I did give it to you, all I gave you was immunity. So I'll tell myself
there you go. So thank you.
I mean, it's crazy because literally right before that weekend, we'd been in New York for a Rising show, and then we immediately proceed to go in person to a cramped studio with you. So from a pure COVID practices perspective, that was a disaster.
Not as big a disaster as my scheduling my entire coast to coast book tour for those 2 weeks, guys. So, count yourselves lucky.
Yeah. Let's start there for those folks who are new or didn't pick up the book. Two-part question. One, just what was and what is the argument about decadence? What is decadence? And in your new Substack, you just posed a question, which I think is helpful for you to answer here, which is, has the pandemic brought decadence to a close?
So decadence, in my thesis, is maybe disappointingly not, just orgies and chocolate-covered strawberries. It is a state that a very successful society can enter into, characterized by stagnation, repetition, and sclerosis, basically systems not working as well as they used to, at a really high stage of wealth and technological development. So as you can probably guess, that's what I think has happened to the United States and really the whole developed world over the last 50 years, that growth has slowed down, technological progress has disappointed outside of the internet, basically. Birth rates have fallen, rich societies aren't reproducing themselves anymore. Everyone agrees that our political systems in the US and Europe don't work particularly well. And then, and this is harder to prove, but I think it's true, you have a certain kind of repetition and a feeling of being sort of trapped in the same political arguments, the same theological arguments if you're religious, and the same Marvel universe if you go to the movies. It's a sort of baby boomer's paradise from which there is no imaginative escape. So that's the argument of the book. And then obviously, a global pandemic is not really decadent. It's rather more dramatic and sort of capital H historical than that. And I think there are certain ways in which, 2020 was not a decadent year in the sense that even, not just the pandemic itself, but the fact that the pandemic era created a context for massive racial justice protests and also some of the worst riots the U.S. has seen in decades, right? That's not decadent. That's change. That's drama. And likewise, something like the way the Trump era ended, the fact that it ended with a guy in a Viking suit storming into the Capitol, right? And sort of seizing the speaker's rostrum. That's a little more dramatic, a little less sort of just sterile and repetitive. So I think certainly in the last year, certain things that I was writing about, certain trends were temporarily suspended. And then the question is, what happens now? And my really provisional answer is that in technology and sort of technological areas, the pandemic probably pushes us out of decadence in some ways. That the sort of the race for the COVID vaccine both proved that we could sort of do amazing science in a hurry, but also sort of created a template that I think could have follow-on effects for a lot of technological changes that have sort of been hovering as possibilities for a while, but could actually get pushed into reality in the next 10 years. So that's sort of the case for COVID as anti-decadence. In other ways, I think socially, I think it could push us sort of deeper into decadence. A lot will depend on what happens as we come out of it. But, having everyone, and especially young people, just sort of spend a year living lives entirely online doesn't seem to be likely to be good for like the social health of Western societies. It's not good for friendship. It's not good for sex. It's not good for relationships. It's not good for marriages. It's definitely not good for having babies. So in all of those ways, I think you could come out of this sort of as a society more sunk in like isolation and anomie. And then politics is somewhere in between, right? Like if you wanted to be sort of a decadence deepens pessimist, you would say, look, before the pandemic, we had these two really strong challenges to the status quo in Bernie Sanders' socialism and Trump's populism. And the pandemic meant that they were both defeated. And instead, we put Joe Biden, candidate of sustainable decadence, literally the aging embodiment of a bankrupt establishment, is now in charge of the country. So that's like deeper decadence. At the same time, if you look at like both the sort of some of the ambitions of the Biden administration, which have excited the left more than the left expected, and also some of the ongoing turmoil on the right with, we're recording this just after Marco Rubio, came out for the unionization of an Amazon plant in Bessemer, Alabama, which is, a sort of a signifier in some way of sort of interesting debates on the right. You can look at that stuff and say, well, actually, yes, it defeated Sanders and Trump, but the tendencies they represented might actually be strengthened by the weirdness of the pandemic. So I'd say too soon to tell on politics and decadence. Ask me again when I come back from my fourth visit a year from now.
Yeah, no, it won't. It certainly won't be a year from now until the fourth visit. I guess the real question is, and let's try and take these in terms of turning points, because I think that's what's so useful is, it's crazy. I can tell you, your book was the last book that I read right before the pandemic, and bumping it up like back to back was so crazy. I actually remember your interview with us on Rising where you said, maybe this is like, I actually think our entire politics is about to get changed by the coronavirus. It's still stuck there. You were one of the last people we ever had in the studio, and you ended up being completely right. And so let's go through like what actually changed in some of these events. Obviously, we had the lockdowns, which precipitated a lot of what could be seen like maybe in the future in the summer. We had, like you said, the protests, and we had the riots. But then it feels like there was this huge stretch of this crazy campaign. Then we had January 6th. How do each of those kind of disparate events fit within not just the thesis necessarily of the book, but like how did they impact the trends that you just talked about there?
And we'd start with lockdowns, obviously.
Yeah.
So, lockdowns basically, I think, sort of took away a lot of the things that exist to kind of stabilize a rich society. Not all of them, obviously. You could still watch Netflix, lots and lots of Netflix, right? And you could still watch online pornography if that's sort of your source of stability. But going to bars, going to sports games, sending your kids to school, this sort of long list of both normal activities and also sort of, if you want to be more cynical, sort of bread and circuses, right? That keep people sort of active, busy, entertained, maybe distracted, shall we say, from some of the deeper problems in society. All of that went away. And I think that in turn is crucial to understanding what happened with the George Floyd protests. I think it's not so much that there was this sudden ideological awakening to the deep truth of racial injustice. I mean, there has been a sort of steadily building movement against police brutality and police abuses, and this obviously sort of partook of that. But it became much bigger, I think, because people were they were sort of desperate in a way for a reason to rebel against a kind of oppressive seeming moment. And this provided a way of rebelling for people who were not, anti-mask protesters and Trump supporters, right? who weren't going to get into that style of direct protest against the lockdowns. This was a different kind of sort of, in a sense, sort of affirmation of people's existence in a weird way against a moment that was, the lockdowns were dehumanizing in a
Yes.
very, very real and profound sense. So I think that's sort of a big part of where the protests initially came from. And then in elite spaces, in, the sort of media, entertainment, corporate complex, it then became a sort of precipitating event for an acceleration of ideological transformation, right? Where you had, this sort of balance in a lot of elite spaces between a progressive ideology and sort of a bland meritocratic proceduralism, right? Both of those things coexist. And the Floyd protests and the general atmosphere of the lockdown gave the sort of more militant progressive side of things this, this opportunity to basically claim a lot more power. And that's, I think, what happened to, not equally everywhere, but in a lot of the sort of internal elite stuff of the summer. There was the drama, obviously, at my own newspaper, but there were similar things, everywhere from, charter school networks to elite colleges to Bon Appetit magazine to the Poetry Foundation, these sort of moments of turnover. And part of that, too, was a real rebellion, I think, against one aspect of the decadence I write about in the book, where part of what I'm calling decadence is basically just the rule of the baby boomers, right? This huge generation of incredibly successful people who have been in charge of our institutions for a long time. And thanks to modern medicine and good diets and exercise, don't seem inclined to leave their positions, right? Like, this is literally the Democratic Party is run by a generation that has been in power for a very long time. And so this sort of racial justice moment became, I think, in many cases, sort of an excuse to sort of either push or try to push an older guard out the door, people who, in an earlier era might have, long ago retired. The sort of the unsuccessful attempt to oust Anna Wintour, right, I think is sort of a good small example of this. So there was a lot going on there.
Yeah.
So one thing, Ross, that I want to get to before we go too much further into the course of 2020 is how it seems to me the lockdown really brought back small L folk libertarianism in a way that really forced Sagar and me and Sagar to rethink a lot of the realignment thesis ideas. So
Yep.
if you listen to this show before the pandemic, we're talking about how the right is now reapproaching its relationship with the state. Oh, like all you people at Cato are silly, X, Y, and Z thing.
I stand by that, but go ahead. Yeah.
Personal attacks aside, like a broad point of how the right is really realigning on these policy questions and is now more comfortable using the power of the state and is now more okay with big government. It's hard to watch not the fake AstroTurf pushback to lockdowns, which I think was a lot of the state capitol protests, but just over time, the slow burn, very Dave Portnoy, Barstool Sports. Why is the government shutting down businesses? Why are we being told what to do? Seeing that for me personally was just like, wow, like we can't just write off this libertarian thing. And it's actually pretty clear you're going to see smart entrepreneurial politicians say, hey, I can capture a lot of that energy without trying to be Rand Paul and claiming that there's this broader libertarian moment. So can you just reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that it's, I sort of went back and forth, right, especially early in the pandemic about how much of the right's response to this is just a reflection of how Trump himself decided to respond to it, right? So if
Hmm.
Trump himself had said, from day one, I'm putting on a mask, I'm closing the borders, I'm going to turn us into New Zealand or South Korea or something. You could imagine a world, and versions of that world exist in other places, right? To some extent in Israel, I think, where the left was anti-lockdown, and the right was defending it, right? So you can tell a story like that where it's just a sort of follow the leader effect. Trump's choices condition conservative attitudes, and with things like masks, I think there is some truth to that. At the same time, I agree with you. I was really struck by sort of the depth of this sort of libertarian impulse in response to a pandemic that, according to a lot of psychological theory, should have brought out this sort of threat-based solidarity among conservatives. Right. And instead it brought out, the sort of Dave Portnoy style effect that I think shaped Trump, maybe not as much as Trump shaped it, but to some extent. To some extent, I think Trump was, especially once he had sort of committed to like not wearing a mask, he then sort of became a captive of this impulse because it became this sort of powerful force on the right that he wanted to challenge and channel. I mean, and probably helped him in certain ways. I think pollsters, elite media types probably underestimated the power of some of those ideas and arguments, especially as the pandemic wore on, in ways that contributed to the surprise of Trump doing as well as he did. But yeah, and I mean, I think, it's a complicated thing because I think in the first, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was sort of extremely hostile to that kind of, what I called, I think, folk libertarianism, and especially its sort of connection to a lot of arguments and predictions about the pandemic, that just turned out to be wrong, right? Like this sort of desperate desire to believe that it was just the flu, and it was not just the flu. This sense that like, oh, the fatality predictions are going to be way overblown, but in fact, they probably weren't. Like more than 500,000 people are dead. So that sort of made me feel really pessimistic in certain ways about the right, that like there was this sense, this libertarianism in the face of a moment that did not demand libertarianism. That said, now a year later, the further in we've gone, the more case studies there really are in sort of, the emergency mentality overwhelming reasonable policymaking. The fact that so many schools have been closed in blue states for so long. It's sort of the sharpest example of, a larger pattern where there really was a ton of predictable bureaucratic overreach, closing public parks, all these kind of things that vindicated, I think, the sort of softer version of the libertarian impulse, not the version that said, don't wear masks, it's just the flu, but the version that said we need to find a way to like balance things out and live with this disease without driving ourselves insane.
And the real test of that too is basically what's happening in month 1 versus what's happening in month 5. That's where you're going to see a distinction between those two instincts. Yeah, sorry.
And this really bothered me, Ross, and this is probably maybe why you were skeptical too, is because what I saw is you saw legitimate grievance around people who couldn't work and all of that being glommed onto by Stephen Moore and Freedom Works and many other organizations in DC being like, see, like we need to end these lockdowns, and that's why we can't have a COVID relief bill. Because if we have a COVID relief bill, we're going to fund blue state lockdowns, which happens to conveniently align with an ideology around deficits and all of that. And watching those two things fuse and enter to the Oval Office with Larry Kudlow, who was the direct pipeline of much of this nonsense up to Trump, is, I think, a large reason why Trump lost election.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
It's just incredible to me. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, there's, this is all hindsight, right? Because at the time, Trump seemed to be behind so far in the polls that it wasn't clear to me in, August or September that there was actually some policy he could have embraced that would have made up an 8 or 9 point deficit. But now that we know that it was actually a 4 or 5 point deficit, and obviously much less than that in the crucial electoral college states, Yeah, I think
42,000 votes.
I think we can say with, at least some mild degree of certainty that a Trump who basically tried to sort of, craft a policy response that was somewhere in between liberal lockdowns and, pure sort of like it's just the flu, open all the businesses conservatism, could have won re-election, and that would have involved pushing for a second relief bill earlier. What Trump did, what his administration did with vaccines was, in fact, in the end, quite successful. And if he just could have, modeled the view that, look, we're wearing masks because we believe that we can get life fully back to normal with vaccines in just 6 months, right?
We're wearing a lock.
Then we're wearing the mask to get out of this, right? Yeah, exactly. To get out of the lockdown, masks as an alternative to lockdown. Right. That would have been the successful, common good, if you will, oriented middle ground. And the resilience of the sort of Stephen Mooreism is in an administration that was supposedly elected to overturn the dead consensus or whatever. That is evidence of decadence on the right as being more powerful than I would like to think.
Could we talk about how the right should really reckon with Trump's loss in these topic areas? Because the thing that's confusing for me is, well, it's not confusing, it's pretty clear. You see the right really failing, in my opinion, to reckon with this checks debate and the COVID relief debate, in the sense that you're seeing a lot of political hacky DC types say things like, Reverend Warnock, where's the checks? You promised 2K checks. And I think, but Republicans
didn't give him it anyway.
Yeah, didn't support the checks. And is the critique of Warnock that he wasn't radically socialist enough, and it turns out he's center left on economic policy? It seems like there's this very incoherent response, which basically was based on the idea that Joe Biden would show up on day one and just be mentally vacant, unable to govern, and just unable to do things. So how do you just react to Biden's presidency, the way he's actually governed on a variety of issues, with how the right is trying to reckon with the post-Trump moment?
I don't know what the politically effective way for Republicans to respond is, because Biden really clearly has a big political opportunity here, where he has inherited an economy that was in good shape before the pandemic, in part because of some of Trump's policies, and the pandemic is not a normal recession, so you're already likely to get this big bounce back. And then we've had this sort of this thing that was apparent before the pandemic has become more apparent now, right? Which is that for really complicated reasons, there isn't a sort of, inflation is not right now, it may become, but it's not right now a big curb on ambitious government spending. And as long as that's the case, that gives Democrats what they totally lacked in the Reagan era, which is the ability to promise a free lunch. The unpopularity of the Democratic agenda has always been that it requires middle-class tax increases to pay for it. But Biden isn't proposing middle-class tax increases. He's just offering money. And at some point that hits a wall, maybe, and the wall is inflation starts to come back, and there start to be various problems of overheating in the economy, and maybe that will happen in time for a Republican revival. But until it happens, Biden just has a lot of running room. And I don't know, from a substantive perspective, what I would like Republicans to do is to say, we agree with Joe Biden that, we should be doing more for the working class, but here is our 5 better ways to do this. Right. And some of them would be more fiscally responsible, the way the Romney, family benefit is more fiscally responsible than just spending, just sort of piling it on top of the existing welfare state. So that would be my ideal. But I don't think there's any definite argument that that's a better political strategy than just sort of, making vague noises about the deficit and hoping that the Democrats get into trouble. I think fundamentally the Republican, if there's a Republican comeback in the short term, it's really much more likely to be about some combination of crime and cancel culture, if you will,
And
in
the
that
border.
sense,
I think the border too.
and yeah, right. No,
Yeah.
immigration too. And in that sense, the journalists sort of making fun of Republicans for talking about Dr. Seuss instead of talking about the COVID relief bill. I mean, they're not wrong, right? That reading Green Eggs and Ham is not like a strong political statement. But in terms of like where Republicans have political purchase for their arguments, pointing out that liberalism has gone way to the left culturally is just much more effective than really anything you can say on economics at the moment.
So I want to pick up on that because this is where we had to grapple a lot with this on the show. Trump won in 2016. I think you, many others to a limited extent said, this is a big deal. This is a vindication of, it's not a total departure from the dead consensus, but it's an opportunity to build something new. Voters are animated by this departure from neoconservatism on a foreign policy side and, a general neoliberal orientation on economics. Then he basically, look, let's be honest here, what was his single, only real congressional accomplishment was a large tax cut, largely for the wealthy and for corporations. On the Federal Reserve side, he did appoint Jerome Powell, who did some excellent things. And for a variety of reasons, tight labor markets, etc., we had good wages. But it's not like he delivered on the agenda that I think a lot of quote unquote new right people wanted him to. He still won 10 million more votes. He won 75 million votes for the presidency. So this is the question, Ross, and I asked MBD the same thing whenever he was on the podcast, which is that if there are people like us who want to see more pro-worker policy pushed, what political justification can we give? Because the truth is, you can govern as a Donald Trump Republican, where all you do is culture war all day long, dialed up to 15, govern as a George W. Bush-ish style person without all of the worst excesses of it, and you can win, pardon my language, a shit ton of votes. You can almost win the election. You can not be boorish.
You can almost. I mean, look, he didn't win the election though, right?
Yeah, but it's 45,000 votes, Ross. Yeah.
Sure, but isn't so? Yeah. I mean, this goes to my general critique of sort of stalemate in our politics. Like the goal of politics is to crush your opponents.
It's agree.
It's not to have a political party. It's not to have a political party that has this sort of weird, probably temporary edge in the electoral college that means that you can claim the presidency 50% of the time with 47% of the votes. Like that is a good strategy for, keeping your donor base happy, even if your donor base's ideas aren't that popular, while also, sort of navigating the complexities of a changing country. And this is why Republicans, they would rather stay in that space for understandable reasons than try and break out of it and risk some sort of actual party civil war or something. But if you're running for president, right? If you're the Republican nominee in 2024, whoever that may be, and obviously there's a good chance it will be Donald Trump. But if you're that nominee, why do you want to do that, right? Why do you want to put your hopes and your hopes of political power rest on 40,000 voters in Pennsylvania? FDR's hopes of political power didn't rest on 40,000 votes. Ronald Reagan's hopes of political power didn't rest on 40,000 votes. And the other
Ross, quick on that.
Yes.
The implication of what you're suggesting is that these people aren't FDR and they aren't Ronald Reagan.
Yes, that is the strong implication. But let me just go further and say, so conservatives feel like they're clinging to political power while cultural power slips away, right? And there obviously isn't some way that you can take political power and just magically legislate against cultural liberalism, right? The world does not work like that. Our constitutional system doesn't work like that. But I grew up in the 1990s, and it really was the case that having Republican presidents win these huge thumping 55% elections did change liberalism. It did actually make liberalism feel like it had to not just cater to its sort of most progressive and most left-wing factions all the time. It really did create this period where, liberals were kind of in conversation with social conservatives in a way that's just unimaginable today. So if your primary concern is not, winning elections, but it's like these cultural battles, you should want to win elections even more. You should want that landslide. And I don't think now, I think it's a separate question whether the new right and populism can deliver that, landslide. Maybe it can't, and there are reasons why maybe it couldn't. But the idea that the status quo is this vindication for, whatever weird combination of the old consensus and loose money Donald Trump embodied, I think is crazy. You need, look, Joe Biden has opportunities just by winning 52% of the vote. Republicans haven't won 52% of the vote in a long time.
But here's the key thing, and that's why the history that I've just read about, because I was born in 1992, so I can't quite articulate what exactly happened.
You're a child.
Yeah, that was just me just throwing that. I just turned 29 today, so I'm edging away from childhood.
Yep.
But the Democratic Party is different than the Republican Party, and a thing that I've really noticed amongst new right people, so people who are interested in this new populist GOP, is that almost to a person, they're all from blue states and they come from Democratic families, as in their parents tend to be upper income professionals who were Democrats. So I think in many ways what happens is you see these new right folks, and look, and frankly, this included me 2 years ago, analogize what could happen to the Republican Party to what they saw, or at least read about, happening in the Democratic Party. But the mistake on my side seems to be the fact that the parties are just different. Like, I think the Democratic Party is driven by policy accomplishment as an actual objective that leaders are held accountable in a way that the GOP is just simply not doing it. If if Joe Biden ran for office and then actually didn't deliver a COVID relief bill, didn't actually provide things for blue states, didn't actually attempt to do SALT tax stuff, there would be serious consequences for that. But if Donald Trump had come into office and not even done a tax bill and had just been Trumpy for 4 years and the economy basically worked, there'd be no consequence whatsoever at all. Like, that's the whole real story of he didn't build the wall. The trade war wasn't prosecuted effectively. He didn't appoint people effectively. I mean, the last thing I'll add here is that, we've talked with the folks, I don't want to say kids, from American Moment. You see the Claremont folks, and everyone's telling this story of, the only reason why this Trump thing didn't work is there weren't the right individuals, there weren't the right staffing, there weren't the right think tanks. And I think that's just bullshit at this point. I think this comes down for the fact that there actually isn't a constituency in the Republican Party that demands policy outcomes. And if there were one, that issue would basically resolve itself. But I don't know, just like, what do you think about maybe the differences between these two parties and how that drives these reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the constituency in the Republican Party that would like the kind of policy outcomes that the new right is touting is basically voters who joined the Republican Party in the last 4 to 8 years and are loosely attached to the party and aren't part of its core. So I think you could find voters in blue and in purple and red states who, would be disappointed in, the absence of an infrastructure bill, right? Or who, would be upset that the Trump tax cuts were so tilted to the rich. And some of those voters probably did, slip back and vote for Democrats in 2018. Some of them probably voted for Biden in 2020. Yeah, sorry, lost track of time. In 2018, and some of them voted for Biden in 2020. But they are sort of the outsiders to the party. They're the people you're trying to bring in, right? And that I think is the challenge. You're trying to sort of manufacture a constituency for conservative populism out of swing voters. Whereas the core voters in the Republican Party are, a combination of people who are, sort of moderately successful Americans who are relatively happy with the status quo and don't look for that much from government policy except to be left alone. That's sort of the old Norquist coalition. And then people who vote Republican because they don't want Democrats in power. And that is, that exists on the left too, right? There are, and more so in the age of Trump, there are a bunch of people now who are like, I'm voting I'm voting for Democrats. I don't care about the policy agenda. I'm just afraid of the, anti-democratic, insurrectionist right or something. That exists, but it's much more powerful on the right, that you have a coalition of different groups, from evangelical Christians to, people, libertarians in Silicon
Latino
Valley
men, dude.
and Latino men who
Yeah,
who just don't want to be. They're afraid of being ruled by progressivism. They're not afraid of big government. Anyway, it's not the Norquist like I'm
yes.
afraid of the IRS. It's I'm afraid of progressives with power and what that means for my institution. And that is not an alliance that sort of naturally seeks an infrastructure bill or naturally seeks pro-family tax policy. It might support it, right? Like if Donald Trump had come into power. I mean, I guess this is where I would defend the American moment case, right? Like Trump comes into power and he's got a cadre of against the dead consensus righties, who, ranging from Claremont to Orrin Cass or something. And he comes in and says, my top three priorities are an infrastructure bill, better family policy, and a wage subsidy for working class voters, let's say. Had he done those things, it's not like the Republican Party would have rebelled against him. Right. And they probably would have been popular, and he might have been reelected. And then, then that at least continues until with George W. Bush, right? George W. Bush had a different version of this where it was going to be like education spending and Medicare Part D, right? And had the Iraq War gone well, that would have remained the Republican position. And it was only because the Iraq War didn't go well, and then we had a little financial crisis, that you had this sort of retreat to like all government is bad government kind of stuff. So I don't know. That's how I would split the difference between, I guess, sort of the ambitions of the American moment and your, despair over the policy disinterest of the Republican coalition.
Yeah. We'll put a cap on this, Ross, in terms of the politics, because we are here to talk about the book, which everybody should go buy, preferably from our bookshop, which is this, January 6th. And you wrote about this in your Substack. In what way do you think that January 6th, the Capitol riots, changed the Republican coalition, politics, and the future? Something I borrowed heavily from you, full disclosure, and I cited you every time I did, so just so everybody's clear.
Plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery.
Yeah. You wrote a column very shortly after about irreconcilable differences within the Republican coalition, in which you have people who will legitimately demand the claim that the election was stolen, that there was widespread election fraud, full dominion, what we're talking about. And then you have suburban voters, some in Georgia, many elsewhere, hundreds of thousands of people who are like, no, I'm out. Like, I'm not going to be associated with this shit at all. And that while it was coming to a head under Trump, the January 6th kind of became a demarcation point of, no, I don't believe this. As much as, you can talk to me about the overreaches of cultural liberalism, I'm not going to sign off. And then an entire other part which says, if you don't say this to me, you're out, you're one of them. Just talk to us a bit about not just the intra-R, kind of coalition things that January 6th has spawned upon us, but really just like as part of your thesis and as for the country.
I mean, I don't know. Like it's, I think we created this space. Trump's post-election stuff created this space where, in the Georgia Senate races, that was absolutely true. The dynamic you're describing, right? Like that's how. It's not the only reason Republicans lost. Like, the $2,000 checks played a role. Like, there were plenty of reasons, but fundamentally, it was this combination of, we're depressing our own base's turnout by convincing them that, elections don't matter because they'll be stolen. And we're sort of selling a paranoid fantasy that like just sort of seals the suburbs revolt against us.
Right.
So that was Georgia. Then January 6th happens. And it seemed briefly like you would actually have this sort of war in the Republican Party over this, that I wrote this. I thought, if you want to imagine a world where the Republican Party breaks, it is that world where, over the next 4 years, there's sort of an unreality litmus test that goes further than, not most Republican politicians maybe, but a portion of the party, the, Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, Murkowski wing, the Larry Hogan wing can bear. And if you have Trump himself or Trump Jr. or someone as the nominee in 2024, sort of running on that unreality, then you get more breakage in the party than you got in 2016 even. So that's possible. But you also sort of notice that since January 6th, one, the sort of permanent insurrection that a lot of liberals and centrists sort of predicted has not come to pass, right? Trump he summoned up this like insane moment, but he did not create a Republican Hezbollah, as far as I can tell, where, this sort of like literal, like constant protests, terror attacks, these kind of things. Now, we'll see what happens in the future, but like the future of like Proud Boys rampaging permanently has not yet come to pass, and instead we're just back to like Antifa protests in Portland as the political violence drama.
But a quick thing to add, because this is important. And once again, this isn't just defending Biden, but because Trump is no longer in office, Democrats actually can fight back. So I'm from Portland, Oregon, so I just always react to people talking about Antifa, which is the second that Trump was off the political scene, Mayor Ted Wheeler is like, we will no longer tolerate this violence in our street, which is the reality of the dynamic, which is that if anything, the political situation with the violence on both sides, to pick a very 2017 phrasing, has been toned down because of that reality.
Yes, no, I think that's right, and maybe that, and then a lot depends on this sort of unanswerable at the moment question, which is what is Trump's own next act, right? Yeah. Like right now, you don't have any prominent standard bearer for sort of full Trump. We were stabbed in the back, and we need to renominate him to take our country back. There aren't like prominent Republicans constantly making that argument, which is good. But Trump himself is the man who can and presumably would like to make that argument. And at some point, he will manage a kind of media comeback, I assume. And then we'll have a better idea, which we don't have now, of to what extent is that narrative a litmus test, right? And there's clearly, like, I was surprised in arguing with conservative friends how strong the belief in the stolen election was among people who I didn't consider either like deep Trumpers or sort of, QAnon types. So that made me think that it would be resilient as a narrative to an extent that would really shape the party going forward. To some extent, though, like in the discourse right now, the stolen election has kind of disappeared, right? Like we're back to a sort of mixture of incoherent economic arguments on the right and, a sort of unity against the excesses of cultural liberalism. You're not getting sort of, demands to primary every Republican who voted to recognize the election. Trump wants to primary Murkowski, but that's different from a if you voted to recognize the election, you are getting a Trump primary challenger, and Sean Hannity is going to support them, and we're going all in. So I don't know. I'm genuinely uncertain about how powerful the stab in the back narrative, the stolen election narrative, is for shaping 2024. And I think we'll get a better handle on it when Trump makes his next real media blitz, which hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm. The real question that comes to mind here is, because you spoke a bit about it earlier, you spoke about 2024 candidates thinking in Reaganite or FDR terms. How do you think and conceive of Joe Biden? Is he FDR? Is he Reagan? Is he LBJ? From my perspective, it seems that Joe Biden basically has one job, and you actually sort of summed this up well in your Substack, where you said something that happened during the pandemic is, at least politically, center-left, like Democratic policy apparatus folks, like they beat back Bernie and they beat back MAGA. And from my perspective, the only job Joe Biden has is just being a normal president for 4 years. Like the reason why I think Joe Biden has the ability to ride out the culture war, cancel culture pushback is he just doesn't say anything about green eggs and ham. That's the obvious. There's a world where you imagine a Kamala Harris administration would have a week of discourse on green eggs and ham and structural racism, all these things. Like it's like the beer summit politics from
honestly.
even
it's Obama.
All this stuff, but Joe Biden just doesn't talk. I think and actually, Ross, I want to hear. This is what I'm actually asking you, as a person who only took in 2008 through 2012 politics through the media. I feel like I was really sold a version of Joe Biden that didn't actually come into play when it actually came down to it. The Joe Biden that I read about was he's this bumbling idiot who, separate from the stuttering, because that wasn't the rhetoric, he was this bumbling idiot who's always talking and has bad political judgment. But at a core level, he stayed off Twitter. And that was just the number one decision that a smart politician in his position had to do. So what is just your reaction?
And also there's a weird way in which the thing that is part of the Biden discourse on the right now that wasn't 10 years ago, right? His age and possible senility is something that has, I think, helped him in certain ways. Like, Biden has lost a step, more than a step. Like Biden is an old man compared to the Joe Biden that I remember as a kid and the Joe Biden of 2008. But that has sort of sanded off one of his biggest weaknesses, which was the fact that he was, an arrogant SOB who couldn't stop talking. And he's not like that anymore. You can still see flashes of it, like,
come on,
look,
dog face,
right? Dog face, right? No, I mean, it's still there, right? But it doesn't. It is contained, because he's an old man now, and that at a certain point, at a certain kind of moment, against a certain kind of Republican candidate, seeming like a really old man could hurt him. But in a dynamic, one where he was up against Trump and now where he's sort of stewarding this likely to happen anyway economic recovery, I think being sort of normal and like in between Clinton and LBJ, basically, like sort of neither the like we're going to do everything, we're going to win everything for liberalism, nor the we're constrained by Republicans, but somewhere in between. That's a sweet spot for a successful presidency that Republicans will lose to in 2024. But there are ways in which, like, the don't mention Dr. Seuss thing works. Don't mention crisis at the border, a little more challenging. Don't mention permanent crime wave in urban America, more challenging, right? So like there are things that you could imagine happening that have happened to some extent. We have had a crime wave that, if they continue and persist and sort of institutional liberalism apart from Biden doesn't know how to handle them, then Biden's position and sort of persona could weaken. But, some of the crime wave is because everyone's wearing masks, right? So like seriously, like this is another example of sort of how the pandemic suspended a lot of these stabilizing things. One thing that stabilized our society is mass surveillance, right? Everybody's on video all the time. So you're not as likely to like carjack someone. But guess what? If everyone's wearing masks, you get a carjacking epidemic, but maybe that just goes away. I don't know. Like Biden may really preside over a lot more normalcy than even it seems right now.
This is something I've been trying to grapple with, which is trying to project out politics in the next couple of years. Because, it's like you said, the economic recovery is coming regardless. I think it probably is helped by $1,400 in the bank for a lot of people, 200 million Americans. Average family of four is getting something like $7,600 in government assistance. People are rip-roaring, ready to get outside. I mean, I can see it in D.C. The moment the weather changed, it was crazy. I haven't seen these people in 6 months. It's just unbelievable. And when you think about when vaccinations hit arms post May 1st, Biden already talking about, I think July 4th is going to be probably the greatest bonanza this country has ever seen. And at the same time, you see news consumption is down like 30%. People are tuning
Apologies,
out
Ross.
the news.
That must suck for you.
Yeah, sorry, Ross. Oh, he doesn't get paid on traffic. He's fine. He's a subscription guy, just like everybody else. Yeah. So okay, news consumption is down 30%. People are going to be in Vegas, on planes, Branson. I mean, it's going to be the boom times out here. Like, what?
Soccer did the Charles Murray test.
Yeah, that's my
in
Charles
14.
Murray. I did my Charles Murray test. I had no idea what the fuck Branson was. I was like, you mean Richard Branson? It turns out it's a very popular destination in America.
No, it is.
Yeah.
It is. I just liked how you worked it in.
Right.
That's the real populism.
That is real populism. That's right. Is me talking about this from my DC apartment. But what does politics look like that? Like, we haven't lived in a country like that in so long. Like, I was talking about this yesterday with a friend, and I was like, man, like, it's been 20 years of shit. Like, we had 2001, 9/11, and then the Iraq War, and then we had the financial crisis.
Katrina.
And then Obama. Yeah, Katrina, Obama, whatever the hell was going on there. Then Trump, and then like 5 years of just like hyper partisanship. And now you're just going to go like enter this like crazy economy. Like, is it going to be more decadent, less decadent? And how does that change our politics?
You set it up as very decadent, Sagar.
I think it is going to be decadent.
Well, but this is important.
Yeah.
This is my idiosyncratic definition of decadence means that like the Roaring Twenties are not decadent, right? Just because people are like, having too much sex and drinking too much, that's not decadence if it's part of an overall period of dynamism and change. It may be a mortal sin that you should go to the confessional for, but it's not under my definition decadent. So if you get a real Biden boom and out of it you get like, a lot of, shotgun marriages and unplanned pregnancies, right? like that's different, and it's a change. And I mean, look, it really is true that whether you call it decadence or not, we have not had a period of sort of sustained growth, sustained economic growth in the United States that was not like overshadowed by something like the Trump phenomenon over the last 4 years since the 1990s. There may just be like what you would expect from the 1990s experience is you can continue to have a certain kind of like partisan screaming and culture war. I mean, we impeached Bill Clinton, obviously. Mm-hmm. But you would expect the country sort of tuned out the Clinton impeachment. The country did not tune out the Donald Trump era at all, but it tuned out the sort of some of the equivalent things in the 1990s. And I mean, I think it's easy to see that just sort of leaving politics in a kind of stable position where, nothing about like a brief surge of economic good times changes the fundamental conservative coalition opposition to liberalism. So Republicans are not going to like be destroyed in 2022. But Democrats might do fine. And the political landscape might be like, an evenly divided Senate and a evenly divided House and Joe Biden president from 2022 to 2024. And then you might have a weird like 1996 style election where, even with the Republican Electoral College advantage, Biden just sort of cruises to a, 5-point popular vote win, 6-point popular vote win, and a closer race in the Electoral College. That if you were like putting money on the near future, that's what you
where my
bet on. Now we could get, China could invade Taiwan. Like, I mean, a million weird things could happen. But that's what you'd bet on. And then the question becomes, from the longer term perspective, like, does that surge help us get out of the larger sort of socio-cultural technological decadence? Like, does it create like this sort of mood where we're like, all right, we're gonna embrace the self-driving car future and rebuild our infrastructure in 6 different ways? Does it create a future where does it sort of, do people go back to movie theaters, right, and go back to all of the museums and symphonies that have been, and churches for that matter? Like, do people go back to church, right? Is there some sort of follow on for community in America? Or is it like this sort of temporary sugar high, and at the end of it, we still have high suicide rates, low marriage rates, deaths of despair, and a lot of sort of nice tech that hasn't been actually adopted yet? And
Hmm.
there, I mean, I wrote the book, so I guess I'm still I'm betting on decadence reasserting itself, because I think there are sort of these foundational problems, demographic and social, that don't go away just because you get a Biden boom.
And last question, because since this is a book show, it should obviously be discussed. What do you think about Amazon right now? Marco Rubio just had his op-ed in USA Today saying he supports the Amazon workers in Georgia who are trying to form a union. He very much couched this in some form of culture war language. There's obviously the controversy of Ryan T. Anderson and just like this broader partisanship within publishing. Just what are your just general thoughts? This is clearly the definition of a developing dynamic where it could go 15 different directions based on the trends we're talking about. But I'm just curious, like, what do you think about the right and Amazon right now?
I mean, I feel like Amazon is just sort of asking for responses like Rubio's. I mean,
Hmm.
my friends on the left are criticizing Rubio because he basically said, "I support unionization in this case because Amazon is picking culture war battles against conservatives," which is
Right.
not a sort of principled pro-worker position exactly. But all principles, start with sort of states of exception. And I just think I think Amazon's strategy here is strange, um, in terms of sort of its relationship with Republicans. I think Amazon is one of the most popular tech companies. People love Amazon for obvious reasons. And so picking political battles with it is sort of dicier maybe than picking political battles with, some of the other big
Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, some of the other big tech companies. Um, as a writer, not just a religious, some kind of social conservative writer, but as a writer, period, the idea that Amazon is exerting censorious powers over the books that it publishes is seems like a pretty good case for breaking it up somehow. Like, I mean, I am
Can I?
more.
Can I? But this is what I want to
Yeah.
push you because once
How
again,
do you?
this is well, no,
Yeah.
no, no, not how, but like so from my perspective, we're in DC. Kramer Books, Politics and Prose, they are not going to host or have Ryan Anderson's book on trans kids on their front shelves. Like publishers, this isn't me trying to just do this libertarian thing of like, oh, like they're a private company, they do whatever they want. I mean, that's true, but also I think it isn't getting to the deeper critique here. My point is, even if you, so this is a good example, even if you broke up Amazon, so even if you said, okay, so you no longer get Amazon Web Services, or maybe the Kindle division has to be separate, the core issue here is that there are center left people who are increasingly socially to the left and are increasingly woke, and they just are not going to be okay with positions that don't accord with that. So even if there's a startup which is doing some innovative new book publishing, they're also not going to have Ryan Anderson's book. So I think when people just focus on the breaking it up argument as some sort of either revenge move or something to actually handle the thing they're supposedly critiquing, it doesn't actually get to it, because even a startup, even a small business also would not host a book if there's this intensive debate about trans people.
It's funny,
I mean,
Ross. I think you actually gave the solution to this earlier in the episode. You were like, yeah, when you win 55% of the vote, then Amazon's going to be like, oh, shit. They actually control, like, there's a lot of people out there who vote Republican, and maybe we should just respect that. It doesn't even come down to legal
I think
architecture.
there's some.
But
I
go
think
ahead.
yeah. I think there's some
Yeah.
truth to that argument that like the goal is to have enough political power that you're basically holding sort of the threat of political retribution, which is sort of what Rubio is doing, right?
Yeah.
Over companies in order to strengthen the hand of people inside the company who think they should just sort of not conduct strong political scrutiny
Hmm.
of the titles that they sell. I mean, I don't know. I assume that if I walked into Politics and Prose and asked them to order a copy of Ryan Anderson's book, they would order it for me. Now,
Yeah, but pretend there's woke Marshall who shows up and says, "Hey, Kramer, Politics and Prose, why are you hosting this book that even big tech Amazon is saying is anti-trans?" There's no
Hmm.
way they keep the book under those circumstances. There's just no way.
I mean, well, but that's then the argument for saying that you cannot have. I mean, there is. I can't stipulate a policy solution here exactly,
Right.
and there may not be one. But the argument with Amazon is that yes, wokeness and woke sensibilities will affect, what all kinds of bookstores decide to sell and what all kinds of bookstores decide to stock. But if you have one company that sells 80% of ebooks and 50% of regular books, then one set of decisions by that company is dispositive within the company, and through the mechanism you just described, dispositive for a range of independent sellers as well. And that's the dynamic that you're most concerned about. It's not even like that I'm afraid of my books being censored, being pulled from Amazon. It's like what Amazon decides then affects the decisions publishers make. It exerts general control over the discourse in ways that are bad for free debate in a free society.
Yes, I completely agree.
And also, I'm also open to the argument that the way it's running its warehouses are make a case for some kind of policy response. But I have not yet read Alec McGillis's new book Fulfillment, which is on my shelf.
Have it pre-ordered.
Yeah. So anyway, that's another argument, an issue. That's obviously the direct issue in the Rubio Union case.
Mm-hmm. Well, it all ties together, Ross. And just as a reminder, we have a bookshop, which is not Amazon, where you can buy a book from an independent bookseller, and you can buy Ross's book. You can support his work, and we appreciate all of you who have been buying a ton of books, really interesting ones. I can see some of the titles, and they're absolutely fascinating. So please check out Ross's book. Ross, you have a Substack. Do you want to promote that, and also just tell people where they should go to find you?
I mean, they can find me at the New York Times, but I am doing this sort of book promotion Substack right now. That I will, I think, eventually, once book promotion is done, or in the temporary hiatuses between periods of book promotion, I'll probably write some TV and fantasy novel reviews there too. So douthat.substack.com, along with NewYorkTimes.com, a little website you may have heard of.
You might have heard of it. Consider me a future subscriber to the Douthat TV and film reviews, and we appreciate you joining us, sir, and we'll see you for your 4th, 5th, 6th, many more appearances in the future.
All right. Thanks, guys. It was a pleasure,
Ross.
as always.